Right. So was hoping to perhaps start with a little bit about yourself, um, before we sort of go on to tiny builds. So maybe you could give us a bit of a background to how
Hmm.
you got started, your early career. I know you started out as a pro gamer at 14. That's sort of a, a pretty
Yeah.
impactful start, and then sort of went on perhaps to some other vocations in the game industry, journalism and game producing and so on. So maybe you could just give us a rundown of all
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy to think that it's been over 15, no, over 20 years, God, that I started. And professional gaming is really the first quote-unquote job I had because I was really good at playing games. So I decided to start competing in tournaments and started making money. So that counts. But then I started to get onto the international arena. I was pretty good at Counter-Strike and Warcraft 3 in the Baltic states. I'm from a little country called Latvia. And then when we got to the more European leagues, everyone realized, okay, just not as good as we should be. So I kind of abandoned that. But what that gave me is an opportunity to talk to a lot of different people and organizations and kind of like started to get a grasp of closer to game development. So that's when I decided to start writing about games, just in my own free time, just writing game reviews, opinion pieces, and people started to read them. And then I started to get job offers for projects, and then went into full-time journalism up until I was about 19 years old. I was a game journalist. And this is alongside kind of abandoning high school in a weird way, because that's right around the time of the financial collapse of '06, '07, '09, depending on where you were. And just decided to start making money helping my family. And eventually, that kind of like that cumulative experience of playing a lot of games, of writing about them, of trying to figure out how the industry works, landed me a job as a game producer. And game production is usually kind of like glamorized in a way in many aspects because the perception at that point that the game producer is kind of like the rock star, like
Hmm.
the movie producer, like it's an incredibly fun job, but actually it's a really interestingly glorified project management with a lot of soft skill requirements. So it's essentially a job of making sure that your team is able to deliver and motivating them, being the HR, being the guy that brings everyone team, being the person that makes sure that everyone's doing okay. And being so young at that point, working with teams of 10, 20 people, everyone a lot older than me, that was definitely an interesting experience. And I got really involved in the product lifecycle. I got actually I was fortunate to be producing some games for the original Xbox Live Arcade, like way back when the Xbox 360 was launching.
Wow.
So did that for a while, and at one point I just started doing smaller projects here and there. Like at one point I made a games website where a lot of Counter-Strike teams would come to every night and pay a little bit of an entry fee and then compete in a tournament. And then we would take a commission of that and scale that into a business that was generating very meaningful revenues. A lot of projects like that taught me about online marketing, right? Of how to make sure that your product gets exposure. And thing was that was kind of done out of necessity in a way because in the region where I'm from, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Latvia, there was no game development per se, right? There was no industry. So I was kind of trying to find a way for myself to get into actual game development. And it's kind of like a series of fortunate and unfortunate events that got me into actual game development, where I started off as a producer on web games, having moved to the Netherlands, just outside of Amsterdam, where I still reside, in 2011. And I was working with a lot of talented developers of Flash games. Those little web games that were
Yeah, yeah, I remember
dominating the
them. Yeah.
early 2010s. Yeah. And a lot of those developers also wanted to transition to more like real games, games that people would want to pay money for, games that you could port to a console, right? And it just so happened that that was when I found one game developer on newgrounds.com. It was used to be this like creative community. His name was Tom Bryan, and he made this little Flash game called No Time to Explain. He made it in a weekend as a joke. The joke landed. The joke was very funny. It's a time paradox platformer where you try to save yourself from the future. And I approach him and go like, "Hey, let's make this into a full game." He goes like, "You're crazy. Let's do it." So we did a Kickstarter back in 2011, which was a new thing. Crowdfunding was not that well developed. We raised $26,000 and used that to fund the commercial, like the real release of No Time to Explain. And the thing about that is, it took 2 years, right, from starting it to fully launching it on Steam in 2013. And that was, while you both have like other full-time jobs, you're funding it in any way you can, emotional roller coaster, everything. So we launched it, overnight success, right? Every indie developer's dream. You have a game that then justifies you quitting your jobs and going full-time and making a game number two. And that aspect kind of terrified me. The idea of that locking yourself in for another couple of years, trying to do either a sequel or something else, and then hoping that the market conditions align again, right? Because that lag is where a lot of studios
Hmm.
fail to like succeed on their game number two. You hear a lot of success stories, but I also see a lot of stories where it doesn't work. So instead, we decided to kind of reinvest all the money we had made from No Time to Explain into co-developing another game and being the publisher for it. And that model was so much more fulfilling because we kind of had this, portfolio approach instead of just concentrating on a single title, where we then signed another few games that we could also publish. And then very quickly, we kind of became this I guess, developer publisher hybrid, where you can tell by my accent, right? I speak other languages. I speak Russian and Latvian. And we were able to establish ourselves within that region of those developers, kind of going from web to proper PC and console. Okay, that's a really long intro. I'll pause here for for questions.
No, that's great. That's yeah,
Mhm.
that's actually covered quite a lot. So
Uh-huh.
so how so that's a really good covering of your sort of pre. So was that, am I right in saying that sort of pre-tiny build, or when you said
No, so
you
mhm.
started producing that first game, was that sort of the inception of tiny build?
Yeah, the inception of Tiny Boat really happened with the Kickstarter for No Time to Explain. That is when we came up
Okay.
with the name. We were like the studio Tiny Boat, right? 2011, we weren't incorporated yet at that point, but we're just doing business as Tiny Boat. But then when we published the first game, the first like co-developed game that we didn't do ourselves, that was also in 2013. That was called Speedrunners, and that's when Tiny Boat essentially was born as a publishing brand.
Got you. Got you.
So 10
Um,
years ago now.
yeah, amazing, isn't it? And then
Yeah.
and so what did sort of the company's growth look like after that, from that point onwards up until, because obviously in 2021 you had the IPO,
Mhm.
but what sort of, how had the company progressed, and how did perhaps your role within it change as it grew over
Mhm.
that period?
Yes, so I was very hands-on on many, many projects. We've published 80 so far, so I'd say that I was hands-on involved in at least 30 of them. And we were a small company for quite a bit, working on several games at the time. And we got into what many call today indie publishing. I'm using air quotes right now for indie publishing, but really what that means to me is third-party publishing, right? Where
Mm.
I'm the publisher, I have some funds, some marketing expertise, some knowledge, and then I go out and fund a few game development studios. We get a transactional contract where we agree to publish their game, we will market it, and we'll make it successful. And that is a great model until the floodgates on all of the platforms open. So when we started, you couldn't just get onto Steam. You couldn't just get onto Xbox, PlayStation. You had to be very, very well trusted by those platforms, have enough connections, and you were kind of the gatekeeper for the platforms as a publisher. So it's great until it all is open up, and then the business model became, I call it the Groupon model, where it's a business that's very easy to replicate. You remember those Groupon clones popping up like 5 years
Yeah.
ago? Like everyone and their mom had one. So this started to happen with indie publishing, which means that we fund a game, we release it, it's successful, we make a lot of money, it's great. The developer makes a lot of money, it's great. But what also happens is that usually at this point, you have funded a new intellectual property that is successful, that then can be taken to the next level. Because when you have something that's already successful, it's much easier to scale it than finding the success. And in this transactional relationship, the incentive between the developer and publisher are misaligned because most of the time the developer will be super happy with the amount of money they made, and they are often, the financial incentive have over exceeded their expectations. So there's no motivation to continue working on and expanding on it. And it may also feel a little bit like the imposter syndrome, like you've achieved more than you've set out
Mm.
for. So that's understandable. But we also knew that this was not where we want to go. So we started to invest into IP. We started to invest into franchise because that is where the long-term value is. And in 2017, we released our first wholly owned intellectual property called Hello Neighbor, which was a runaway hit. It gathered millions and millions of views on YouTube. The sales were phenomenal. And that kind of proved to us that investing into an asset we own is really vital. But what it also allowed us to do, this is something that not many people realize about the Neighbor franchise, is when in 2017 the first game was releasing, we had already started working on game number 2 and game number 3. Because
All
remember,
right.
I mentioned that game lag 2 years to develop.
Mm.
That's the challenge of the industry is people forget about your game unless you have a lot of things happening in quick succession. It's so risky to have a sequel release a few years later without any other products in between. So 2017, the original Hello Neighbor launches. 2018, a prequel launches. 2019, the multiplayer spin-off Secret Neighbor launches. 3 games in a row. In between, we launched a comic book series that sold 1 million copies. We launched a series of board games that sold hundreds of thousands. We launched a book series that, with Scholastic, has sold over 4 million copies, right? Then we release a mobile version for free that gets over 100 million downloads. And that's kind of like, how you build a franchise. That was making a lot of money, and we were reinvesting that back into new IP and scaling existing franchise. And that's kind of the transformational years for Tiny Build, which started about 5, 6 years ago. We went from being this transactional indie publisher. And again, there is nothing wrong with that model. It's just that what I want to do is I want to build a company that builds franchises that have a mix of existing IP that you expand and investing to new IP. And that meant that we had to, buy intellectual property, create our own intellectual property, and also integrate studios internally. So right now, our headcount is mostly game development studios. We have 14 spread across the globe, and most of them are now working on their second installment in the franchise that they're working on.
So what was it? So it sounds like fairly early on, even at the point of you sort of re-releasing the first game, after you acquired the IP. It sounds pretty early on. You sort of realized that Hello Neighbor was a good
Mhm.
candidate for a franchise. So what sort of made it stand out in that respect?
Yes, so we realized that Hello Neighbor has a lot of engagement with a slightly different target audience because right now the sentiment in the investment community, at least, or in the in with analysts who analyze PC game publishers, is that it's all about Steam, and that is understandable. Steam is the biggest distribution platform, and it's the easiest to get data from. What we realized with Hello Neighbor is that there are many more gamers out there that don't even know what Steam is, primarily on console, but it's also a different audience that doesn't need to be told if the game is good. What they need to do is have the let me think the English word. They need to feel like they're involved in development, right? So
Right.
they actually want to feel part of the development process because for them it's more interesting than the final result. So what we did with the development of the original Hello Neighbor is we made it a community effort. We made it kind of like this puzzle, this mystery box, where during development we would release builds that would promote interest and into what the game's story is. What is the puzzle that people are trying to solve? And if you search for things like Hello Neighbor Story Explained or Hello Neighbor AI Story Explained, you'll get. And do you want me to spoil it? Because it's been kind of 5 years since the game released.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so the game is actually two layers, right? One is that it's a creepy neighbor that is living across the street that probably has someone kidnapped in their basement. So naturally, you want to sneak in and you play against an advanced self-learning AI that reacts to your every move, right? So that's what people perceive the game is, and that's what most journalists perceive the game was. What fans realize that that is not the game. The game is playing in development builds, being part of this community, and discovering really odd things about a self-learning AI that eventually becomes sentient as you play the game. So the true game is a couple of layers deeper. It's kind of like the TV show Westworld. If you watch it season one, you will know what I mean. Where it's
Mm,
about finding consciousness and realizing that you as a player are actually torturing this AI. And what he wants to do is to be set free. So that's once we had that plan in place and started to test it, right? The community reaction was phenomenal, and we knew before the game's launch that this was going to be big and that we wanted to scale it and use that as kind of like, the blueprint framework for our other franchises.
very interesting. Yeah. So, uh, on the subject of future franchises, a couple that were mentioned, perhaps in your report or some publications, were sort of Streets of Rogue and
Hmm.
Totally Reliable Delivery Service. So, how,
Hmm.
and I know you've got a Streets of Rogue 2, which is more of an open
Hmm.
world version coming out. I'm a big fan of the first game, by the way. But it's, yeah, so I'm just sort of wondering how, with those sort of franchises, how the potential franchises, first of all, are they, am I right in saying they are candidates? And secondly, um, what do you see in them? Are they similar to the Hello Neighbors? What you saw in that, or is they completely different and they have their own unique qualities? What sort of allowed you to identify them as potentially good candidates? Is it just how popular they were originally as the initial release games?
Kind of. I think the examples that you mentioned are prime candidates for franchise, and we are working on next installments in those series. The thing about both of them is the amount of time that people spend with them on average per person. And this is something that we look to. So, Streets of Rogue, you probably can imagine how people spend hundreds, even thousands of hours within it.
Hmm,
So that means that it's becoming one of those games that you play for the full year, right? You just open it up every night, and then you take a break to play like the AAA Elden Ring, God of War, etc. for a week, and then come back to playing Streets of Rogue. And this is where I want to be with our franchise. I don't want to be the game that people take a break for. I want to be the game that people take a break from and then come back because that's a
interesting.
much more reliable model. One would say it's totally reliable. Okay, that's a terrible joke. Um, but that is where I want to go. It's about the time that people spend in our franchises, and it doesn't always have to be in the game, right? For example, we're now working on the Hello Neighbor cartoon, which is getting incredible reception. And then the idea that you can use things like animated series to sell your game copies and to re-engage your audience is really appealing to me as well. So we are working on several continuations in the series and IPs that we own, and some of them have already a lot of plans for extensions. It's just that we don't like talking about things that kind of like what is going to be your favorite game of the year. Like I don't want to say because
Hmm.
we need data to verify and to still have this portfolio approach of what we communicate is going to be successful.
Absolutely. I can see a lot of potential for the Streets of Rogue universe extending out into other
Hmm.
media and so on. It's definitely a good candidate for that with all the characters and so on. Um, yeah. So another sort of strategic move you've made in recent years has been a move towards sort of games as a service. So
Hmm.
perhaps you could sort of like give us an idea of how you define that and perhaps some sort of examples of games
Hmm.
that you define that would fit that mold right now and where other ones potentially in the future.
Right, so for us, game as a service is really applicable to pretty much any single game in the portfolio that we continue to work on post-release. The traditional definition of GaaS or game as a service is usually for multiplayer games, usually free to play. That does apply to us, but we extend that to single player games as well. So, for example, a game will launch, it will do well, and then we will either do an update for that specific game, as a service to our players, or we will add on pieces of downloadable content later on, and then do a heavy discount on the main game, therefore driving sales to it and awareness to the DLC, which will often result in year number 2, 3, 4, 5 in the game's life cycle being the best one. So I think this is key for a lot of people to understand is unlike traditional belief, when you launch a game, you have 6 weeks and then it drops off. For us, it's about the longevity. And often the first year is not the best year in terms of the game's life cycle. So that's how we define game as a service. And it just means that
Interesting.
a lot of work is being done on back catalog games, on games that are already out.
And so the monetization there is largely using DLCs and like you're saying, discounts on to keep driving
Mhm.
people back to and expanding the user base of the game is the main focus over the
Yep.
years. Yeah.
And bringing those games to new platforms as well, right? Because
Mm.
that it sounds easy when you look at Unreal Engine or the Unity game engines. You go like, oh yeah, they support consoles. It should be easy to bring your games to consoles. No, it's not. Quite often, actually, it can cost the same or even more amount of money to bring the game to consoles as it is to develop it for PC.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Um, so another big part of your strategy is merger and acquisition. So I think, as I understand it, the motivations for this are to increase your own IP for the increased margins and all the other sort of franchise potential benefits and so on that you've outlined, and also more recently, sort of vertical integration as well. So
Mhm.
you've expanded your publishing capacity with Versus Evil. You've also added on sort of quality assurance with Red Cerberus, and then
Mhm.
I think also D Magic has expanded your sort of porting capabilities. Is
Mhm.
and then you've got sort of like a few different models for this. So sometimes with your if you're looking for an IP or just the and to expand to get the development team that developed it on board, you'd sort
Mhm.
of do the acquire hire model, and then compared to in other cases, you've also done sort of full acquisitions and IP only ones as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so maybe you could just sort of go over this a little bit and maybe outline if there's any other kind of in the vertical integration, if there's any other sort of components of the pipeline perhaps that you're looking to add.
Mhm. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. When you describe it like that, it's like we're grabbing onto everything, right? But really, it all goes into the strategy of building franchise. So what do we need to build franchise? We need intellectual property. We need people who can actually create that intellectual property, and we need the publishing pipeline to be able to release those games on time, on quality, and on budget. So to do that, we did start to integrate vertically, and the creative business in games is very interesting because it's a people first business. You don't have much without the people actually working on these great projects. So the best way we found to align incentives is to be part of the same family. And that's actually the main reason why we went public. Because in the private sector, it's difficult to create like truly aligned motivations, right? Because you can give all of the options and stock units you want when they're not, liquid, when there's no like price associated with them, it's really
Mm.
difficult to keep people aligned and motivated. So after we went public, we have accelerated on M&A. And what we're doing most of the time is the acqui-hires that you had mentioned, where we already work with a team. We love working with them and we want to, kind of like put a ring on it and actually integrate more deeply. And this gives a lot more stability and freedom for the studios that join us. And it creates more value for us as a whole. Because when you're at that level, you can afford much more R&D. You don't need to be pitching to different publishers. You can spend time on developing something new, unexpected, and then still have the freedom to work on it. And we want to empower more and more of our teams to be able to deliver things that are unexpected, you know? So in terms of structure, the acqui-hire, what that means is we essentially create a new entity legally. We do all of the backend operations and everything and put the people into that entity, put the IP into that entity, and then we have no potential liability from buying an actual asset, right? It's not always
Mm.
possible, but that's the cleanest way to do it, and it has worked for us so far. And in terms of the services businesses you mentioned, indeed, bringing those in-house makes us much more independent from external factors. Because a lot of game delays over the pandemic, especially, have been due to external dependencies of studios. You know, you want quality assurance and you have to wait for a couple of months to get that done. Or if you need code optimization or porting or localization, everything was backed up. So like the physical supply chain was backed up, the vendor supply chain was also backed up.
Mm. And then, of course, the other aspect is you've got your own DevGam
Mhm.
developer conference, which is another sort of, in a way, another aspect of the pipeline, isn't it?
Yes, it's a way for us to essentially position ourselves as a thought leader in the industry and be able to talk to many developers in different regions and also find new and interesting projects. Like some of the best and most interesting projects we have released came from very in-depth brainstorms. You know, when you're at the conference, you're not at home, you want to talk to people and bounce ideas around. Some of those ideas have manifested into our biggest hits. So for us, having that strategic investment in an events business has been really fruitful over the years.
And is there anywhere is there any other sort of part of the stack there that you feel would be a candidate for acquisition, or do you think would it's currently a bit of a bottleneck, or have you pretty much smoothed everything out now and you've got everything you need in house?
We're always looking at assets out there, right? The problem with the private markets and you know with some companies that are at scale is there is a lag in valuations when you look at private versus public. So when the public sectors get a sobering on bloated valuations,
Hmm.
it takes up to like a year and a half for the private markets to catch up. And we've always steered away from auction style M&A opportunities when you know that the company is on the roadshow and then turns into a bid war. And the like last year, there was one case when we sit down, look at a potential company to acquire and do valuations, and we go like, okay, you know, this can be really easily justified at, I don't know, 20, $30 million, and it sells for 10 times that. That's when
Wow.
we knew like, okay, maybe there's a bubble.
Maybe, yeah. Um, so I wouldn't mind just focusing a little bit on the versus evil
Hmm.
transaction because that was one of the biggest ones. More so much
Hmm.
the integration. So it's increased your publishing capacity and it's given you some expertise, perhaps in
Hmm.
some areas that you hadn't previously gone into before, like sort of RPG and strategy games. I've actually been playing Hand of Merlin recently, which is
Hmm.
has been a good one. Um, and I understand the Banner Saga is one of their most famous uh, series
Hmm.
they've published. But sort of generally, I was wondering. So, in terms of sourcing from going forwards, you're looking to move more to a from a third party to a first and second party IP process. So I'm guessing that's going to be um, approaching some of the developers they've as you've done previously with your with Tiny Build,
Hmm.
approaching some of the ones that they already have existing relationships with and stuff like that, and trying to see if they're good candidates for if they'd be up for sort of acquire hire type transactions. But also, I mean, I was wondering, are they still as versus evil still got some sort of because you're doing much a very you talk about having a decentralized sort of model. Are they going to be still very much sourcing their own ideas, or when you say you're increasing it's increased the publishing capacity, does that mean that you're going to give them games that you've sourced that you don't have the capacity to publish? Is it going to be a bit of a combination of the two? How about that?
Yeah, so the last one, I've actually seen some peers try that, and no one wants to feel like they got the second best, right, in any
Hmm.
situation. It's kind of like handing off. So it's going to be a mix of helping them accelerate the transition to second party because, well, 2 years minimum to develop any new game. So that is going to take a little bit of time while we optimize the efficiency. Because what happened at Tiny Build is last year was a very, very accelerated restructure in the middle of relocating hundreds of people from things impacted by the Russian-Ukraine war or the invasion of Ukraine. And we've been able to test a lot of structures that we're now applying to more parts of the business. But the key here first is for Versus Evil to transition to working on larger scale games with own IP, and then look at if the structure allows for managing internal studios. Because you can't just like wake up and decide that you're going to be managing studios. It takes a lot of time and expertise because you go from a business where you manage transactions and contracts to managing people. So I wouldn't want to commit to that, right? Until we know that we can actually do it. It's the same with any kind of new aspect of the business or any kind of new strategic initiative. We don't want to commit to it until we test it, make sure that it works.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I just sort of wanted to finish by changing tack completely. I understand you're a South Park fan. Is that correct?
I've been watching South Park over the years, yeah.
I was going to ask you, have you got a favorite episode?
Oh man, the most recent seasons, my favorite episode is probably the ChatGPT one. That's just so spot on and like so incredible. And really, the last season, also the one about the startups and the hot dogs. If you look at all of South Park, I'd probably say that um, the Stick of Truth episode was really good, where they kind of like promo. So essentially, the whole Lord of the Rings parody series that they had. And I also love the movie. The movie was unexpectedly great.
It was, yeah. And on the subject of Stick of Truth, have you played the games?
Yeah, I did. Absolutely.
I found them quite difficult, not because the gameplay was difficult itself, but because I was laughing so hard I couldn't mash the buttons hard enough to get to complete it.
It it was the first instance of when you feel like you're actually playing the cartoon, right? Because Matt and Trey, they were involved in it. All the voice acting is the same. The animation is very, very similar.
I understand they
So
wrote the script as well, the whole story.
yep,
Yeah,
yep, yeah, you can definitely feel it.
incredible work, isn't it? Yeah. Um, I think that's pretty much all the topics I had on my list to discuss. Is there anything else you think we've missed that you'd like to get out there?
No, I think it's a very interesting time for us, and in the context of being a listed company, we listed when it was like quote unquote easy mode, right? When all the
Mm.
markets were up, and we kind of like graduated to hardcore mode right now, which is where we're at. But it's always darkest before dawn on the share price, so I'm very optimistic about.
Yeah, I mean, you had a pretty crazy year from that. Yes, last year from that point was I think was over 100 employees you had to relocate due to the
Yeah,
Ukraine
yeah.
war. Yeah, really incredible effort sort of to have that all. I mean, you said you had a bit of a a war game sort of strategy planned out for that war room strategy type thing all in place beforehand, and it was just then suddenly you didn't think perhaps you were going to have to put it to go with it, and but you had to, and yeah, it's yeah, really impressive. So anyway, is there? I just sort of wanted to give you a chance to sort of hand off. Is there anywhere people should look to find you? I know you're on Twitter. Do you want to give like your Twitter handle and any other resources you want people to go have a look at?
Yeah, just my last name is Nichiporchik, and that's also my Twitter handle. So good luck spelling that. Just go to tinybuild.com or follow Twitter on Twitter at tinybuild, and you will find my profile. Yeah, on the tinybuild.com about page, or if you just search Alex Tinybuild, you'll find me.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Alex. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, James.
Thank you. Bye.